Has the prosecution in Sean Diddy Combs' trial just proven a clear-cut case of bribery, a major underlying alleged crime of racketeering? Well, not only did a former security guard at the hotel where Combs allegedly beat up Casandra Ventura testify that Combs paid $100,000 for that surveillance footage, but then we heard from Combs' former CFO, the money trail. Oh, and by the way, someone had an outburst in court and was kicked out. Quite the day, and Law&Crime's reporter Ellizabeth Millner is on with us to break down everything that happened. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is another Law&Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, just takes a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on screen, click the link below, or head over to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. What a day in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial. You know, I got a lot of questions about how is the prosecution proving racketeering conspiracy on top of the sex trafficking and prostitution charges. But how are they proving racketeering, right? That Combs agreed to run this criminal enterprise that engaged in a pattern of illegal activity, that there are all these underlying predicate crimes. The prosecution has to prove at least two. So there's forced labor, kidnapping, arson, sex trafficking, drug offenses, bribery. Well, that one is very important and very particular to today. Why? Because we heard from a former security officer at the Intercontinental Hotel out in LA. So this is the site of where Combs purportedly beat up Casandra Ventura, victim number one in this case, back in 2016, an event that was captured on footage. And by the way, remember prosecutors say that she was leaving a freak-off at that time, that this is evidence of sex trafficking, that Combs was using force to induce her into engage in these freak-offs. But we also heard from the former CFO of Combs operations. Oh, and by the way, someone was banned from court and somebody else was kicked out of court for an outburst. So for that and more, I want to bring on Ellizabeth Millner, Law&Crime's reporter, who has been with us every day of this trial. Elizabeth, so good to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come back here on Sidebar. So let's start there. Someone was kicked out, apparently had an outburst, and somebody else has now been banned from the courtroom. And by the way, this was all in the morning before any testimony even began. What happened?
Yeah, a lot happened this morning, bright and early this morning. And to your point, Jesse, it happened before the jury was brought in, before the witness took the stand this morning. And a lot of us just kind of in the media, we've been kind of knowing about this person who we were all expecting to make some type of outburst. We were just kind of waiting on when this would actually occur. And so that was kind of the topic of discussion. So it wasn't that surprising that we saw this woman who we've been referring to as the MTA lady. We don't necessarily know if she works for MTA, but she kind of always wears this MTA jacket when she comes to court, and she's someone who stands in line with us in the morning. And so we've seen her. She isn't like as abrasive as maybe we were led to believe until we saw what had happened this morning. And so what had ended up happening is there were some arguments outside the presence of the jury. They were discussing Mia's testimony, and then all of a sudden I hear just kind of some screaming or yelling coming from behind me, and it was the exact same woman we all thought it was going to be. And so initially when court started, we thought that's when something might have happened, when Diddy was brought in, because it seems from our point of view that she might have been someone very much on the team defense side, team Diddy side. So we were thinking, oh, something might happen as soon as he's brought in. But no, we were in the middle of arguments. We were listening to what both sides were saying just regarding Mia's testimony. And then I look up from my notepad as I'm writing these notes, and she's just like facing the door, kind of looking like she's about to exit the courtroom. And then the marshals are coming kind of inward. And so it seemed like that there was going to be this big confrontation, but she's just yelling and screaming at the marshals pretty much. You heard curse words flying. You heard her pretty much say that, oh, you should pull out your gun or do this, do that, that type of thing. And then all of a sudden we saw the marshals kind of take her out of the courtroom. It took a couple of marshals to get her out of there. there, but she was yelling, she was screaming, she was saying things along the lines that this was the prosecution's fault. And so it was pretty disruptive this morning. And surprisingly, again, that this was something that had happened before. So not only was she kicked out of the courtroom today, but she was kicked out of the media overflow room during jury selection, from what I've heard. And so it seems like she's been disruptive, again, not once, but now twice. And it seems like, as far as her wanting to get back inside this courtroom, she doesn't look like this will happen.
And Elizabeth, didn't she say they're all laughing at you to Diddy or something like that?
So I did hear that part whenever I was leaving the courthouse today. She was still kind of in this vicinity. She was still kind of doing, I guess, these interviews with these bloggers or vloggers, that type of thing. But yeah, she was kind of summing it up and saying that people were laughing at her. I don't think that's necessarily the case as far as what had happened this morning, but it seemed like she felt like she was kind of the butt of everyone's joke.
Oh, see, I thought she was basically saying, like, she was saying to Diddy, they're all laughing at you out there, because again, she does seem like her comments from the reporting that she was pro-Diddy, so interesting to say the least. By the way, before we get into the person who has been banned from the courtroom, we'll get to that. You mentioned the arguments. There were arguments that were happening right before the outburst. Didn't they have to do with what the prosecution wants to introduce into evidence now, which could be very, very interesting if that's the case?
Yeah, for sure. And it seemed like after Mia was done with her cross-examination, I felt like maybe, you know, and these are just my words, I'm not necessarily sure this is how they felt, but it seemed like the government really kind of felt defeated in a sense. They were talking about her cross-examination, hers being Mia's cross-examination, and just how the defense was very abrasive with her, that Brian Steele was yelling at her and essentially yelling at a victim of sexual assault and sexual abuse. And so what the government was proposing is that they wanted to offer Diddy's jailhouse calls because they want to produce the excerpts as soon as this evening, and they feel like they're relevant, these jailhouse calls, because they corroborate Mia's testimony that she felt compelled to write those happy birthday messages throughout the years, saying happy birthday to Diddy even when she no longer was under his employment, even after that she had parted ways with Revolt Films and with Diddy's companies. And so they had brought this up, not even surprisingly, they had brought this up previously during the pretrial hearings, where they were saying that Diddy, even from behind bars, was coordinating these specific kind of social media campaigns, whether it was to get his children to say happy birthday, capture it on video, then post it to his Instagram, just those types of things. And they were kind of bringing that back, where again, they were making the argument that Mia felt compelled to do these happy birthday posts, and they want to bring on these jailhouse calls because they believe that Diddy uses his birthday to kind of shape the narratives, and they believe that these jailhouse calls are probative. And again, this is something that they've been talking about since the pretrial hearings, where it seems like, again, even from behind bars, Diddy's kind of still directing things and kind of trying to, I think, reclaim his public image, that people love him, that people wish him well, that people, even on his birthday, even when he's locked up, will still wish him happy birthday and again wish him well as he's going through this criminal trial now.
I always wondered if his alleged activity from behind bars, including allegedly contacting people through improper means, was going to make its way into this trial. So it's possible it might. But now let's talk about the person who is officially banned from the court. You talked about Mia, so alleged victim number 4 here, testified under a pseudonym. This was a former assistant of Combs, claims that she was physically abused by Combs, that she was forced to work these long, crazy hours, but also that she was sexually assaulted by Sean Combs. So a very sensitive, important witness. Her identity remaining anonymous was important in this case, but my understanding is somebody was banned from court today who may have violated that, right?
Yeah, that is something that happened, I believe, yesterday. And the government did bring this to the judge this morning, where they were talking about how some of the attorneys were walking outside, kind of in the square area where a lot of us kind of go. We turn our phones back on after not having them all day. And somebody who was sitting, I believe, on the press side yesterday was live streaming during this, or making some type of video where, instead of referring to Mia as Mia, that is her pseudonym that was assigned by this court order, instead Mia was referred to by her real name. And so what ended up happening is the judge and pretty much the courthouse ruled that this person cannot go back into the courthouse, can't go back into the courtroom. And so we didn't see this person this morning, this individual that they were talking about, nor do I know this individual's name, but I know of this person. And so from what the government's perspective was, that they really just wanted the judge to kind of do something, knowing that we have another person who's testifying under a pseudonym as early as maybe tomorrow or even on Thursday, and that person obviously being Jane. And so from the government's perspective, it wasn't just that one instance of the person who was doing the live stream or doing the video saying Mia's real name. They also got another alert that somebody on Twitter or X also revealed Mia's true name after one of the exhibits by the defense was leaked or released. And so instead of redacting her photo or redacting her image, this Twitter post or X post just went up using Mia's real name. And so what the government did ask the judge is if they could find some type of way to order that this post be taken down. Not sure just the judge's kind of full extent as far as ordering this specific Twitter account. Not sure what this Twitter account's name is or anything like that, whether or not the judge can step in. But as far as Jane is concerned, they are making some different changes that are different from how Mia was testifying, where they're not going to be showing the exhibits to the public. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be seeing them on the screen whenever she does take the stand. However, the government did assure that the public would be getting the redacted exhibits of Jane's text messages, images that they are allowed to show that aren't sensitive in nature, but they just won't be coming whenever we see her testify later this week.
I'm not surprised by that. I've always been the point. I'm a member of the media. I don't think, even though there's an evidentiary value about what's going on those tapes and whether or not Sean Combs can be heard on those tapes, coercing her into certain acts, I think the risk of everyone else seeing it outweighs the benefit, even from a reporting point of view, but clearly important for the jury to see it. Okay, now we got to talk about Eddy Garcia. Okay, so Eddy Garcia came up yesterday first. So he wanted to invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. He was actually granted immunity to testify. This former security officer at the LA Intercontinental Hotel back in 2016. I'll tell you what, seems like it made sense that he wanted some sort of protection because he admitted to quite a lot. He helped support the bribery allegation, one of the underlying crimes of racketeering that the prosecution is hoping to prove, right? Because what did he say about that day in March of 2016? What did he see, and who was he contacted by?
Yeah, well, according to Eddy Garcia, when he was on the stand, it seemed like he was really kind of involved in a lot. So we meet Eddy on the stand yesterday, but then he took the stand again this morning. He was questioned by Mitzi Steiner. So what we know about him is that he's 33 years old and has been working in private security for about 13 years. However, in 2016, specifically on March 5th of 2016, which we all know now if we've been following this case, which we sure have, that this was the day of the Intercontinental Hotel incident between Diddy and Cassie, where Cassie was allegedly leaving a freak off and then Diddy had attacked her, something that we all have seen at this point, the surveillance video. And so Eddy was talking about how on that day he was notified about an incident, the specific incident being a domestic dispute, and then he points out that this involves Sean Combs and Casandra Ventura, points out Diddy in court, that type of thing. And so he said that he understood that under this immunity deal he had to be truthful in his testimony, but he was talking about how even during this incident he was just 24 years old and had only been working on the job just for a couple of months before this incident occurred. And so then he kind of discusses who his higher-ups are, or who his supervisors are, that being Bill Medrano, Director of Security, and Officer Israel Flores, the Assistant Director of Security. And one thing that Eddy Garcia said during his testimony that I thought was pretty interesting is that he's actually friends with Officer Israel Flores even to this day. He said he saw him a couple weeks ago. They didn't discuss his testimony, but he did say he saw a little bit of testimony on TikTok. And so that was kind of an interesting point. But then we get into the exhibits. And so what do we see from these exhibits? We see an employee sign-in register sheet, which kind of showed the hours that Eddy was working on the day of this incident. So he checked in around 2 p.m. and then he's supposed to leave his job at 10 p.m. every day during that time period. But however, on March 5th, kind of trickling into March 6th, he didn't get off until 1:30 in that morning, or 1:30 that following morning. And so he said he was shown surveillance video of this incident, and Eddy Garcia said that he could monitor the cameras at the security base, but he could see more than one camera at a time. But again, these cameras are motion censored, so he doesn't capture every single thing at every single moment, and plus there's a lot of cameras from his description of it. So then we see an exhibit, and this being the exhibit of the surveillance video from the incident. We can see Cassie in kind of that elevator bank or elevator lobby, if you call it that, and then we see kind of the point to where Cassie's kind of in her purse and trying to grab, I think, shoes or something out of her bag, and then you see Diddy come up, he hits her, he kicks her, she's on the ground. So it's something that we all have seen. It's nothing new to the jury, but Eddy Garcia was saying that at first during this incident, he didn't even recognize Diddy or Cassie, but he later learned it was the two that were involved in this, what was labeled as a domestic dispute. And so he said when he arrived at work, law enforcement wasn't contacted after this incident. And Eddy Garcia had said that it was because Cassie said that she didn't want police to be involved and that she didn't want medical attention. And so he had reviewed the incident report when he had arrived to work. And so then we see the incident report in an exhibit, and that again being from March 5th of 2016, where there were attachments to this report, including even video. And so Eddy explained that he got a call during his shift, about an hour and a half into his shift, but it was a call that didn't appear local, nor did he necessarily recognize this number, but it was an interesting person who had called him, and that person was none other than Christina Coram, who was Diddy's kind of right-hand gal. She was kind of, in a way, not just a fixer, but also his like executive assistant, and somebody who we, even at Law&Crime, know very well, it seems like, just from everything that has to do with Christina Coram. And so Christina had asked about this incident to Eddy, and had even requested a copy of the video, or just see the video so she could understand kind of what everything was going on with it. And so Eddy had said that Christina said that Diddy was intoxicated during this incident and that he didn't remember. And so there was an objection from the defense. That objection was sustained. There was a big sidebar, and then, not sidebar by Jesse Rubber, but there was a big sidebar, and then they kind of came back and started asking more questions. The prosecution was. And so Eddy had told Christina Coram that she needed to reach out to management. Then an hour and a half later, Christina shows up to the hotel, and she showed up to the hotel lobby asking about this video. And so Christina said that she was unaware of what happened on the video, but that she wanted to talk to hotel management. And Eddy Garcia kind of, I guess, tried to help navigate her into what she could do next, but kind of told her off the record, but on the record while he was testifying, that this incident was pretty bad. And so Christina called later again after leaving the hotel and passed the phone along to who else? None other than Diddy himself. And so Diddy had a chance to speak to Eddy Garcia, and Diddy said something along the lines of, "Do you know who I am?" And Eddy Garcia was like, you know, he recognized the voice. He knew it was Sean Combs, aka Diddy. And so Eddy was explaining that Diddy sounded nervous on this call and was talking super fast, kind of how I always talk, and that Diddy was saying that he had too much to drink, and said something along the lines of, "You know how women are. If this video gets out, this could ruin me." That was kind of the gist of the call. And so Eddy was explaining that Diddy was stuttering through this, but had requested the video, and Eddy had told him that he needs a subpoena to get this video. And so then Eddy Garcia sends an email to his higher-ups just about Diddy calling, requesting this video. And so we see an exhibit of Eddy mentioning this to his bosses. And so it says, "Mr. Combs, who is staying in room 602, requested to have a sit-down meeting with you in regards to the incident." And then I'm paraphrasing here. Mr. Combs mentioned that he has a lawyer who had notified him that there was a thumb drive and was really concerned. And so at the bottom of this email, then we see kind of a link or just a contact information for Christina Coram. And so Christina then contacted Eddy multiple times after this. Even when Eddy was at home, she somehow got his personal number, and Eddy was saying that he didn't even provide his number to Christina or even Diddy. And so he said he was nervous and scared about why he was getting calls to his personal line and how the two even obtained his personal number. But Christina said that she would introduce herself again and gave the phone to Diddy, and Diddy had told Eddy Garcia that Eddy sounded like a good guy and that the footage could ruin Diddy, and that he wanted Eddy to do something about this video. And so Eddy was explaining that he didn't have access to provide the video. He didn't have the credentials to get the video from the server, something that Officer Israel Flores had testified to, because he was one of the first witnesses called, that really the only people who could grab the video, obtain the video, was the director of security. And so that was Bill Medrano. And so Bill did have access to the server, and Diddy had offered to take care of Eddy Garcia and whatever he needed. And what did Eddy think that this taking care of meant? Well, he thought it meant financially. And so Eddy Garcia then went back to work. He reached out to Bill Medrano, who again is his supervisor, the director of security, and Bill said that he would do it. He would get the video for Diddy, but he would do it for a price, and that price was $50,000. And so Eddy had called Christina Coram back and Christina gave the phone to Diddy. And Diddy sounded super excited, according to Eddy, and referred to Eddy as Eddy, my angel. I knew you could help. I knew you could do it. And this is Diddy talking to Eddy at this point. And then Eddy had told Bill, after he got off the phone with Diddy, that everything was a go and that Diddy wanted this particular video ASAP. And so Bill Medrano showed up to work the next day. He went up to the server room. He pulled the video and just put it on a thumb drive, and then the thumb drive was then given to Eddy. And so then Eddy told Christina Coram and Diddy that he had the thumb drive of the video. Diddy responded that he was happy and excited about this, and Diddy gave Eddy an address to meet with him ASAP because he wanted this video now. And so what we see is kind of Eddy's timesheet from the day when he goes into work, leaves work, that type of thing. But on this particular day when Eddy was turning over this video to Diddy. It's now March 7th, but it shows that Eddy had been working that day from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. However, he being Eddy, said that while he was on the stand, that Bill said that if anyone were to ask where he was when he wasn't at the hotel, just to say that he was running errands. And in a way, he was kind of running errands. That errand was to meet Diddy to exchange this video in exchange for money. And so Eddy had explained that he had arrived to a high-rise building. He called Christina Coram's number. Then somebody from security came down. Eddy said he can't remember the name, so we don't know who this particular security guard was, but Eddy was saying that this security guard was telling Eddy that he did a good thing. And so when Eddy arrived, it was Diddy, Christina Coram, and then this unnamed bodyguard. And that Diddy seemed super happy and excited just about obtaining this video. Diddy asked Eddy if he had it being the drive, and Eddy just handed it over. So then Diddy left the room, but then when he returned, Diddy was asking whether or not this was the one and only copy. Are there other copies? Are there other duplicates out there? And that he didn't want this video to get out. He was even asked if there's anything stored on the cloud or any backups of this video. And so then Eddy just makes sure with Bill that this is the one and only copy, and Bill told Eddy it was the one and only copy. And so Eddy said that Diddy said it wasn't just him that was concerned about this video getting out, but that Cassie was concerned about this video getting out, and whether or not Cassie might possibly make a police report. This was Eddy's concern to Diddy, and Diddy told Eddy that Cassie knew about this and she wanted this video pulled too. So then Diddy FaceTimes Cassie. Cassie was wearing a hoodie, we presume, possibly to cover up her injuries, that type of thing. But it's not like we saw any exhibit photos of what she looked like after the fact, beyond what she had testified to when she was testifying. But Eddy had explained that Diddy directed Cassie to tell Eddy that she wanted this video gone too, and that Cassie herself said that she had a movie coming out and she wanted this video to go away. And so that was kind of the gist of what had happened before the video was turned over. There was a lot that even happened after the video was turned over.
And look, I think that point could be helpful for both the prosecution and the defense. Well, you know, for the prosecution point of view, you have Combs, again, directing Cassie to say this, right? Or the defense could say, hey, listen, this wasn't about a criminal trying to conceal evidence of a crime. He was trying to make sure evidence didn't come out, or make sure a video didn't come out that could embarrass him and Cassie. He was trying to protect both of them. So it'll be up to the jury which way to view that, although, you know, based on the timesheets, right, and based on his testimony and the email, you could say he's providing credible testimony. On top of the fact, what's his advantage to testify, right? He wanted to have a Fifth Amendment protection, gets immunity. Why? Because we didn't even get to the payment yet and what he didn't do, or allegedly didn't do, because he admitted something. So talk to us about what the payment was, what the instructions were regarding the payment, what he signed, and he didn't report it, right? So talk to us about those things.
Yeah, so even after Eddy Garcia turned over this thumb drive to Diddy, Diddy wanted more. He wanted Eddy Garcia, he wanted Bill Medrano, and he wanted the security officer, who we know to be Officer Israel Flores, to turn over their IDs to Diddy so that way he could take care of them. And again, by taking care of, Eddy interpreted that to mean financially. And so I thought it was interesting that he had wanted Officer Israel Flores's ID in particular, because if you remember when Officer Flores was testifying, that he said that Diddy had tried to shove money in his face during the incident and how he didn't accept it. He kind of turned it away. And so even while Eddy was on the stand, he described Officer Flores as kind of a stand-up guy. He wouldn't go for this, he wouldn't do this, but Diddy ended up getting 3 IDs, one being Eddy Garcia's, the other being Bill Medrano's, but then the other third person was a man named Henry Elias, who was the other security guard who had been working at the hotel around this time. So then we see exhibit photos of all 3 men in their ID photos. And then Diddy asked Eddy Garcia to sign an NDA afterwards and promised that this thumb drive, this particular surveillance video that by now, again, a lot of us have seen, was the one and only copy that was made. So then we see an exhibit photo of the NDA, and it said something along the lines of, because got to paraphrase because it was a pretty lengthy legal document. It says, "I represent and warrant that I delivered all evidence giving rise to the surveillance video recording. I represent there are no duplicates, backups, stored drives. I have permanently deleted all texts and other communications." And so Eddy was explaining that he signed this NDA on March 7th of 2016, but another point is that Eddy, who again is around 24 years old around this time, said that he didn't even read the entire document, and he didn't even get a copy of this document even after the fact, after he had signed it. And so we saw another NDA, but this NDA from Combs Enterprise, and it was an agreement on November 6th of 2015, but as the government pointed out, that date was completely wrong because it was supposed to be on March 7th of 2016, but for this particular NDA, it also read something along the lines of, recipient understands that Combs is a highly prominent recording artist and entertainer. Recipient agrees to pay $1 million as liquidated damages if in breach of agreement. And so what the government did is they try to point out, you know, like Eddy Garcia around this time, again, 24 years old, but also at this time making $10.50 an hour. So how could he come up with $1 million if he was in breach of this agreement? But Eddy did sign this non-disclosure agreement too. He said, kind of similar to the other NDA that he signed, that he didn't read this document either, and said that the reason he didn't read this was because the goal was to get out of there ASAP. And so afterwards, after he signed the NDAs, Diddy grabbed the NDAs, he left the room, but then when he returned with a brown paper bag and a money counter. And at first I thought the money counter was like an actual human or a person, but no, it's a machine, because when you're rich, you can just put a bunch of money into a money counter, and it was a lot of money, where Eddy was explaining it was stacks of $1,000 at a time, and in total it was $100,000 that was put in this money counter. And how does he know it was $100,000? He saw the display of the money counter at the end of the money count. And so Eddy Garcia explained that he actually took the extra money, and that Diddy's bodyguard was present during this meeting and present when this money was counted and present for the payment. And Christina Coram was also present during this counting of the money, again, that being $100,000, a very large stack of money for sure. And after being handed the money, Eddy said that he got up to leave, and he was escorted out by Diddy and this bodyguard. And Eddy was explaining that he was nervous, but Diddy asked him how he'd spend the money and told him not to make big purchases. And then this was a point that was objected to by the defense. That objection was sustained, but that afterwards Diddy signed his valet ticket. But Eddy interpreted to this whole big purchases kind of comment as possibly a way that it wouldn't draw attention if he was to make a large purchase with this money that was in cash. And so that's where the objection was actually. But Eddy said that afterwards he drove off, and that he told Bill about the money, because again, Bill Medrano at this point had only requested $50,000, and he got that $50,000. Then Eddy got the $30,000. So there's $20,000 left, and that went to the other security guard, that being Henry Elias. And so what did Eddy Garcia do with this money? Well, he said that he bought a used car with it. So he said that he didn't report this cash on his taxes, and I think maybe that kind of played into the fifth or the immunity deal. But Eddy said that a week or two later that the incident report and the video were missing from the folder, and that Diddy contacted Eddy around Easter saying Happy Easter, God is good, and asked if anyone had inquired about this particular incident. So again, this happened in March, and Diddy, even at Easter, was still thinking about it on his mind, even sending a message to Eddy asking him whether or not someone was asking about what happened. And so Eddy explained that no one had inquired about the incident, and that Diddy ended this call with saying that if Eddy needed anything, that he should let Diddy know. And so Eddy asked something from Diddy a couple years later, or just a year or two later, around 2017, 2018. He couldn't remember the date, but he asked to work for Diddy as far as working with him in security, and he reached out to Diddy through Instagram. However, Diddy didn't reply to this message. And then from Eddy's standpoint, he said he didn't think about the video, think about it, recollect this video, until he saw it on a media outlet, and we presume that media outlet to possibly be CNN or possibly the other outlets, including ourselves, who also released the video right when it was first released. And he said that he later learned of other copies of this video by Officer Israel Flores, and that Eddy Garcia deleted the text message he had with his friend, again, that being Officer Flores, about the incident. He said that he deleted the text messages between him and Henry Elias, the other security guard, and said that he just wanted nothing to do with it. And so he met with the government in June of 2024 after this video was released, after it went public, but he didn't tell the government about deleting the video during their initial meeting. He didn't reveal this piece of information until his second meeting with the government, after he wasn't being represented by the Securitas legal counsel anymore. He got his own attorney, and then that's when he revealed to prosecutors, or federal prosecutors, I should say, just everything that had happened with this particular video.
Oh, I could see why he wanted some protection, right? Deleted messages, didn't report it on his taxes, allegedly lied to police. I mean, that's a problem. That's a problem. But key witness, and it goes to the idea of credibility. Clearly, he doesn't want to testify. Clearly, he's incriminating himself. But, you know, he has that protection to talk about it. Again, goes to, I believe, the bribery allegation, maybe even obstruction, this idea of why it's so important for the racketeering charge. And he mentioned Christina. I've been saying Christina Koram. You say Christina Koram. I'm not you know better than me. But I believe she's going to have to testify. She's been talked about so many times during the course of this trial about what her involvement in Sean Combs' operations were, whether or not she was facilitating any of these alleged crimes, whether she was a knowing or unknowing co-conspirator. Again, racketeering conspiracy. He couldn't have just agreed to further a criminal enterprise or further, racketeering activity or a pattern of crimes. He can't do it by himself. He had to have a co-conspirator. Is she the person? Are they saving her for the end? So it's very interesting that he mentioned her. Now, very curious to see what the defense was going to do under cross-examination. I mean, what can they cross him about? What can they question him about? Now, I understand he was questioned. I also understand they didn't ask him a lot of questions, right? What was the focus of the cross-examination of Eddy Garcia by Sean Combs' defense counsel?
Yeah, and to your point, Jesse, the cross-examination went pretty quick. And also to your point, I was wondering where it would go, as I always do with the cross-examination sometimes. But just as far as Brian Steele doing this cross-exam, because he was the one who did it on behalf of the defense, he was asking Eddy just about how Diddy was professional with him during this meeting where there was an exchangement of cash. The defense was saying that Eddy was truthful about getting more money than was requested because, again, Bill Medrano just requested the $50,000. However, Eddy revealed not only to us in the public, but also to the jurors that he took a little bit of cash too, $30,000, even more than Henry Elias went home with when he only went home with $20,000. And so we saw the exhibit of the NDA again. And so then as far as the questioning from the defense, it really kind of touched upon the exclusions from the NDA, which read, a disclosure of confidential information in response to valid order by a court or other government body, or B, as otherwise required by law, will not be a breach of this agreement or a waiver of confidentiality for other purposes. However, that recipient provides prompt prior written notice thereof to company to enable company to seek protective order or otherwise prevent the disclosure. And so then we saw another exhibit, and this was kind of a zoomed in version of the non-disparagement portion of the NDA, where we just kind of saw that you're not to disparage Combs or Combs Enterprise, that type of thing. And then it really just kind of went by quickly, where Brian Steele had asked Eddy Garcia whether or not he went to law enforcement about this incident, and Eddy responded that he didn't go to law enforcement at first about this incident. And so I was kind of like, okay, that's kind of a weird place to end, but that's really just where the cross-examination ended. However, on the redirect, I kind of understood why they were asking this. And so the redirect goes back to the Combs Enterprise NDA, the exclusions from the NDA again, where that portion where it says, however, that recipient provides prompt prior written notice thereof to company to enable company to seek protective order or otherwise prevent the disclosure. And so Eddy revealed on his redirects he did go to law enforcement. It just wasn't LAPD or local police officers. Instead, it was to federal agents when he had met with the government about this case.
And I think the defense was trying to say, hey, you could have spoken to authorities. We're not trying to keep this from a criminal prosecution. We're not trying to cover up evidence of a crime. He's a celebrity, he has a girlfriend, he didn't want it to get out into the open. That's simply what it is. NDAs are not foreign to celebrities, and if he really needed to tell the truth to authorities, this piece of paperwork was not going to prevent him from doing so. Sean Combs was not preventing him from doing so. Hey, the $100,000 was not a bribe, it was a payment to say thank you for what you did. Okay, might have been maybe a stretch or not. By the way, before we go into the testimony of Derek Ferguson, which I think is really important, we talk about money trail. I understand that Christina Khorram's phones were seized as well, right? Didn't we get a confirmation of that? Which, again, makes me think why she might have to testify.
So we did learn even previously that a Homeland Security investigator did also seize Christina Khorram's phone even prior to what we saw from the exhibit of the stipulation. So the jury was present for this. However, there was no witness on the stand, but what the prosecution did was show up an exhibit about a stipulation about seizing Christina's cell phone and extracting the contents of her phone too. And so what we learned from this is that there were 24 contacts in this particular phone, and that Christina had contacted Eddy My Angel as well as Eddy Intercontinental Hotel. And then we see an exhibit of Eddy Garcia, Henry Elias's and Bill Medrano's ID. And then that kind of wrapped up the stipulation portion. But it does seem that they are kind of gearing up for her to testify, because she has been mentioned at length a number of times throughout testimony, throughout this trial so far. And so I feel like it's only a matter of possibly days for her to possibly take the stand. Now, the government hasn't said that she is going to be taking the stand definitely yet, but I think we can possibly expect that. And I feel like she'll be a huge key witness for them if she does take the stand for them, for the government.
So now let's talk about Derek Ferguson. Okay, so he takes the stand next. What was his exact position, and what did you learn about the company's finances? I mean, the finances of the different Sean Combs businesses, how Combs got paid. So who is he, and what do we learn about the finances?
Yeah, so we learned about Derek Ferguson, who took the stand right after the stipulations had occurred, and he was questioned by AUSA Mary Slavic. And so while Derek was on the witness stand, he said that he did receive a subpoena to testify, so he was ordered to by the federal government. And then at the beginning of his testimony, he's shown an exhibit photo, this one being that photo of Sean Combs on a red carpet, and verified that it was Sean Combs, aka Puffy, PD, Love, that type of thing. And so Derek Ferguson worked with Diddy and his companies for a number of years, from 1998 until 2017. So that's a long period of time. And he's had a bunch of hats when he's worked with Diddy. He was the CFO of Bad Boy Entertainment from 1998 to 2012. He went on to be the chief growth officer, and then he was also the chief operating officer of Revolt. And so as far as his work with being the CFO, the chief financial officer, Derek had explained that he had overseen finances for the company. He was responsible for accounting and record keeping, and that Bad Boy was a collection of companies that were owned by none other than Mr. Sean Combs. And so he had explained that when he had first started over at Bad Boy, that it was just 3 or 4 who were working in the finance department, but then that department grew as Sean Combs' businesses grew, and that department grew from 3 to 4 people to about 10 people. And so he said his duties included setting budgets, receiving accounts that were receivable, but also accounts that were payable. He was in charge of deal making, and he managed Diddy's personal finances at time during his tenure. And so he explained that his supervisor varied kind of over the course of the many years that he had worked for Sean Combs, and said that sometimes it would either be the president of Bad Boy who he would report to, or it'd be Sean Combs directly who he would report to. And so he said contact with Diddy had decreased over time, and that Diddy was more like a chairman than involved into the day-to-day operations of his businesses. And so then we see exhibits of Paul Alford, who we know to be Uncle Paulie. However, when Derek Ferguson was on the stand today, he didn't know what Uncle Paulie or Paul Alford's nicknames was, so he just referred to him as Paul Alford. He said he interacted with Paul regularly, and then we see an exhibit photo of D-Rock and Roger Bonds, who are also security guards, and Derek had explained that he didn't interact with them, D-Rock and Roger Bonds, as frequently as he did with Paul Alford. And so then they kind of got into how whether or not that Derek had interacted with Diddy's assistants about scheduling, and that's what he said that was kind of the basis of his only interactions with Diddy's assistants. But then goes into that Diddy was the sole owner of Bad Boy Productions, that he did marketing, he did films, and that the record company was a little bit different from his other ventures, and that Derek Ferguson was explaining that some of Diddy's business ventures were partnerships, including the record company that was a partnership, but also Diddy's Sean John line was a partnership. But overall, Diddy's companies were very profitable, and that Diddy drew his salaries from the record company, from the clothing line, from Revolt, and it was determined with his business partners, Diddy's business partners, just as far as his salary was for the different businesses that he had, but also the operating agreement that was decided between the business partners. And so we kind of get into the banking and finance, where they were talking about just how Diddy would open up different bank accounts. So for example, Derek Ferguson was explaining that all of Diddy's companies had their own bank account, and that it was kind of a standard structure for them to do it that way, and that the finance team oversaw these bank accounts. And the banks that were included Citibank, HSBC, and Signature, and those were just some of the banks that were used. So then we see an exhibit of the bank opening document, or a bank application, and this account title was to Janice Combs Music LLC. However, even though it's under Diddy's mother's name technically with the LLC, it is something that was owned by Sean Combs, and that the address on this particular document was to the Bad Boy office. I think it was like 1710 Broadway, and that the account type was a checking account. And so I was kind of like, okay, where are we going with this? And we saw that Ferguson's initials were on this particular document, and that we saw kind of a zoomed in version of this document under the authorized signer section, where it was signed by not only Derek Ferguson but also Sean Combs. And Derek Ferguson was explaining that Janice Combs Music was an account used for providing name and likeness, and that the account was self-funding, and it was a profitable company. And we saw an exhibit of another bank account application, this one for Combs Enterprises LLC. This account type was also a checking account, and Diddy and Derek Ferguson's signatures were on this account too. And this particular account number that ended in 619 was used for the Ciroc brand, and it didn't require funding. And so then they kind of get into the credit cards, how they were used for American Express. Invoices were paid for by expense forms with checks or wires, and that as far as cash is concerned, incoming cash was an industry standard. Artists were always paid in cash for their appearances, and that outgoing cash was a per diem. It was a cash per diem for projects. The process for incoming cash was cash receipts, forms handed to finance by the artist or the manager, and then the process for outgoing cash was handled through petty cash accounts or cash advances. And that the prosecution had asked, was Derek Ferguson aware of Diddy kind of having large sums of cash? And Derek Ferguson explained that he wasn't aware of this. And then they kind of got into Diddy's personal spending before we kind of got into the lunch break. And as far as just where I thought this was going, this line of questioning was going, I had no idea at the first half, but it was the second half where I was kind of like, oh, okay, I can see where the prosecution was kind of going with this. It just kind of took a while to get there a little bit.
So I think it's relevant to establish establish some building blocks, right? So they're a building block trying to understand the finances of his companies, trying to understand the finances of Sean Combs, whether or not he had cash on him, in order to determine what was he doing with the payments. Was he using payments to further criminal activity, to pay for the freak-offs, right? And, you know, it comes up later, and we'll talk about it with Cross. But remember, with racketeering, if we're talking about a criminal enterprise, the flow of money is very important, particularly if the prosecution is arguing or will argue that that Combs was using the business's resources not only to further criminal activity, but was the racketeering activity, all of this criminal activity, was it benefiting him? Was it benefiting his businesses, right? Criminal enterprise, common purpose. So before we get to the Cross, there was a lot of discussion regarding internal transfers, right? Some of where the money was being paid, including a $20,000 transfer that I think is quite important based on what we've heard from prior testimony, right? So what did we learn about these transfers?
And again, to your point, Jesse, I feel like sometimes when we're inside that courtroom, I'm just like, where is this going? And then when I saw these transfers and the dates of these transfers, then it really kind of clicked into my head. But it was kind of a slow burn process from the prosecution to really kind of get to the point, in addition to the points that were made at the beginning of Derek Ferguson's testimony. So we see a number of exhibits. This is post lunch break. We see a bank account application for Diddy's Alpine, New Jersey property. We see a bank account statement for the Alpine, New Jersey property, a statement from December 1st of 2011 through December 31st of 2011. So in this summary, it says beginning balance, credits, debits, ending balance. And so Derek Ferguson was explaining in this particular statement that $3.4 million went into this account. A lot of money, Jesse, just for the month of December of 2011. There's a lot of money, but also that $3.2 million went out of this account. And so we saw internal transfers from specific dates. So there were two dates at first, December 1st and December 2nd, again of 2011, where there were internal transfers of $200,000 and $50,000 to Janice Combs LLC. Then we saw more internal transfers, these ones from December 5th, December 6th, and December 9th of $865,000 for 207 Anderson LLC. That's his Alpine, New Jersey property. And so I kind of have been writing notes to myself. I'm like so confused on where this was going. But then Derek Ferguson is asked who decides to initiate internal transfers. And he responded that it's the controller who worked for Bad Boy. Then we see a statement again from December 1st to December 31st of 2011, but outgoing transfers from December 14th, where the description says outgoing wire transfer, and this one being to Cassie. It was for $20,000. And then I think the big one was on December 23rd of 2011. So again, this was around the time that Cassie Ventura had sent this email to Capricorn Clark, to her mother, explaining that Diddy was threatening to release sexually explicit videos of her. So when I saw December 3rd, 2011, then that date really kind of clicked to me. And what do we see? We see an incoming wire transfer from Roderick Ventura for $20,000, who we believe to be Cassie's father. And then we see a transaction December 27th of 2011 where it says outgoing wire transfer for return of funds to Charter Oak Grove. And so Derek Ferguson was explaining that he wasn't involved in this particular transfer. And again, he was talking about how he left in 2017, only kept in touch for birthdays and holidays. But even before we get to after Derek Ferguson had left, just around this time frame of 2011, this was around the time where when Cassie's mother took the stand that she had explained that she had taken out $20,000 to send to Diddy because she believed that her daughter's sexually explicit videos were going to be released. And so what ended up happening, as we know now, is that this money was sent back into the Ventura parents back into their account. So they got that money back, and we did see that outgoing wire transfer was sent just 4 days later from when it was initially transferred. And so then we kind of get to the end of Derek Ferguson's direct testimony, where he was asked whether or not that Diddy had, he had spoken to Diddy recently, and he explained that the last time Diddy texted him was pretty recently, and it was in September of 2024. I say recently, but it was almost a year ago at this point. But he had texted him on September 16th of 2024 and asked Derek, hello, can you give me a call? And that Diddy just wanted advice from Derek Ferguson as far as why he was reaching out. But Ferguson wasn't in New York around this time period. Diddy was in New York, as we all know why he was in New York, but that he just didn't end up responding to his message. And that kind of wrapped up his direct testimony just as far as what he had seen financially from Diddy.
So very important stuff there, right? So obviously the money backs up the account of Regina Ventura. It backs up what, that whole back and forth about how the money was transferred and why it was transferred and how it was given back. But, to reach out to him the day, I think you said the day of his arrest, right? I think that was when he might have known that he was about to be arrested, wanted to know a little bit more about his finances. Or maybe if you believe the prosecution, he's not the first witness he contacted after Cassie Ventura's lawsuit, after an investigation was opened. Did he want to get some stories straight? Was he, trying to influence potential witnesses? That's an allegation I think the prosecution may be making. Because for him to reach out to who's a critical witness talking about the flow of money and finances, it's interesting to say the least. Now, the cross-examination by attorney Mark Agnifilo was, I think, very, very important for a number of different reasons. And there were parts of it I want you to get into about what you think he was doing and where he was going, because towards the end of the cross-examination, he was pretty straightforward with the questions he was asking him, right? And we'll get into that. If anybody had any questions about what the cross-examination was about, it was definitely illuminated at the end, and we'll talk about it. But where did he go in his cross-examination? What was he questioning Derek Ferguson about?
Yeah, so Mark Agnifilo, he has this style of just very, I think, not casual, but very kind of welcoming, I would say, to the witnesses that he's cross-examining, where he's like, hi, I'm Mark Agnifilo, I don't believe we've met. He kind of starts his cross-examinations in just that type of tone. And so what I think he was trying to do is kind of really establish that Derek Ferguson had worked for Diddy for a number of years and wanted to kind of get to the meat of what he saw while he was on the job. Because again, working from 1998 to 2017, that's a long period of time. And so the defense was first asking Derek whether or where he had went to school. He went to school at UPenn. He grew up in the Bronx, and that Derek Ferguson had gone on to Harvard Business School, graduating in 1990. So kind of building up just his resume in a way, it seemed like. And that after graduating from college back then, that he went on to work at a magazine, then went on to work for Burleson. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that, but this particular company owns part of Bad Boy. And so then Ferguson is asked, can Mr. Combs do what he wants with Aerostar, which I guess he's like, it kind of falls under that umbrella where they're just 50% owners with one another, just essentially one of Diddy's business partners. And Derek Ferguson was explaining no, and that these operating agreements are always drafted and written up by lawyers. And then Mark Agnifilo asked, why did you want to work at Bad Boy? And Derek Ferguson, like a lot of the other employees that have testified so far in this trial, was kind of explaining that they needed more companies that were hiring people from the community, because again, he grew up in the Bronx around this time, and that you could kind of make a name for yourself, be a high-level executive, and that Bad Boy was giving a lot of opportunities for very hungry people who just kind of wanted to come up in the ranks around this time period. So then Mark Agnifilo is kind of asking about the onboarding process for Bad Boy, how the interviews went. And Derek Ferguson was explaining that they were fairly normal for a small company. He said he doesn't remember interviewing with Vashta, who worked at HR around this time. However, he did do an interview with Benny Medina, who was the former president of Bad Boy. And notably, Benny Medina also represents J-Lo. He not represents like an illegal matter, but represents J-Lo as far as her manager goes. And I think at one point even represented Tyra Banks as a manager. Just a little fun fact there. But Mark Agnifilo was kind of asking about the specific time frames from 1998 to 2012, where more businesses were being added, and that Diddy's business ventures all together were just growing, and that even as far as the record company goes for Bad Boy Music, that there was kind of this move from, records, that hard copy and CDs, tapes, that type of thing way back when, to digital music. And that because of this, recording companies kind of shrunk in terms of profits. But then Ferguson was explaining that when he had started, he had worked with Benny Medina, who again was at that time the former president of Bad Boy. And that then they start to kind of get into Diageo a little bit. And that's where I was kind of like, okay, where are we going with this? Why is Diageo being brought up in this? But I think what the defense was trying to do is kind of point out a little bit of why Diddy might be suing Diageo or was suing Diageo. And that was, did you observe Diageo marketing Combs's liquor brands to certain demographics? And Derek Ferguson responded that the facts were their distribution was concentrated, and he said that it was concentrated in an urban area. And that was something that Diddy in his suit against Diageo at the time had explained that he had felt racial discrimination because he wanted to expand it a little bit more beyond just the certain concentrated markets, as Derek Ferguson pointed it out to be, and just wanted to expand it beyond what kind of Diageo was giving to them. And so I was kind of like, okay, where are we going to go next with this? And so then the defense was asking about Revolt Films and their investment. And so to me, what it kind of signaled is, okay, are they kind of trying to talk about Mia in this sense? I didn't know kind of where they were going with this, because then they start bringing out a whole bunch of organizational charts. And these ones in particular we saw were the Revolt organizational charts, July of 2016. So we see an executive group for Revolt, including Derek Ferguson, who was the chief operating officer at that time, but Diddy wasn't in the executive chart in this particular one. We see the ad sales chart, we see pricing, planning, traffic chart, we see the integrating marketing chart, we see the distribution, affiliate, and consumer marketing chart, we see the production, creative, production, post-production chart. So we saw a whole bunch of charts. And then we see the Combs Enterprise organizational chart. And this was a photo of just all the leadership teams, which included Derek Ferguson, which included Diddy as the chairman and CEO. It included Diddy's sister Keisha, who was the director of philanthropy. And it included the finance team of Tony Abrahams, who took on the role of being the chief financial officer. And Derek Ferguson had explained that he kind of pulled Tony Abrahams up into the ranks around this time, that they both went to Harvard together. The press had thought Tony Abrahams was supposed to be testifying soon. The government had pointed out his name, I think, a couple days ago, but then he hasn't come to the stand yet. So possibly we could be anticipating his testimony too. But then the defense started to kind of get into the personal versus the business expenses, and that Derek Ferguson never saw Diddy sit with the statement and necessarily circle what was business or what was personal. It was always the finance department's job to do this every month. They looked to determine what was business and what was personal. And then Derek Ferguson kind of talks about the tax issue and whether or not the taxes were done correctly. And he explained during his tenure that the taxes were always done correctly.
So to me, it seems like they were saying, look, Combs couldn't just do what he wanted to do with this money. It's complicated. BMG owned Arista, 50% of Bad Boy, couldn't just use the company's resources to do whatever he wanted. That Mr. Ferguson wasn't just hired by Sean Combs, maybe to be his guy to do his bidding and further this criminal activity, that Combs wasn't looking around and sitting there looking at the Amex bill and how everything was being used and covered up. Because again, these were businesses that, and this is what I took away from the testimony, that when they're entered into partnerships, everything was an open book. If this really was a criminal enterprise, if he was using the resources to further criminal activity, wouldn't he have tried to keep it hidden? Wouldn't it have been found out? I think that was the biggest takeaway for me. But again, as I said, if anybody was confused about it, towards the end, didn't Agnifilo ask him straight up, did you see anybody commit any crimes, or did it benefit the company in any which way?
Yeah. And so Mark Agnifilo, really towards the tail end of the cross-examination, was just like, well, you didn't see Mr. Combs commit any crimes. Derek Ferguson said no. Any threats? No. Any violence? No. Any emotional, physical, or sexual abuse? Diddy's over there nodding at the defense table like, yes, but Derek Ferguson said no, he didn't witness any of this. Mark Agnifilo asked, did you see any acts of prostitution during your 19-year work period or your work tenure? And Derek Ferguson said he didn't see any of that. And so Ferguson had explained that he had texted Diddy even after, because, you know, the defense kind of likes to point out that the employees, a lot of the former staff, always kind of send well wishes to Diddy even after the fact, even after they're no longer working just within the Combs enterprise, and that Derek Ferguson said that he did learn a lot from Diddy, and that they were talking about kind of how Diddy showed him the difference, or that Derek Ferguson showed Diddy the difference between being great and being the greatest, and the difference is just caring about people. And then I thought what was interesting, though, towards the tail end of the cross-examination, though, Jesse, is that the defense asked Derek Ferguson, how does he feel about Diddy today, given these criminal proceedings, given that he's testifying even in his federal criminal trial. And then there was just really this long pause, and to the point where a lot of us with our notebooks were like, okay, what's the answer going to be? There was a long pause, and Derek Ferguson said that he just didn't know how to answer that question, and that was his answer to the question. He didn't know how to answer that question. And so that's when the cross-examination ended. They go into the redirect, and that's when they kind of bring in just about Revolt Films, and then they bring in this portion of the organizational chart that the defense didn't point out, and that was where you could see that McGeough was the director of development and acquisition. Christina Coram was the director office of the chairman, points out Derek Roche, D-Rock, Hakeem the driver, Paul Alford, who we know to be Uncle Paulie. And then he was asked whether or not that, because he had been working out of the New York office, because he was based in New York, whether or not he saw Diddy in hotel rooms or at Diddy's home. And Derek Ferguson said that he didn't see him, you know, in his hotels or at his home. And so what Mark Agnifilo did under the recross was, well, the CFO doesn't need to see Diddy or Sean Combs at a hotel. They don't need to see him at his home because it's his personal time. And I think the defense is kind of trying to have that ending point there. And then there was an objection from the government. That objection was sustained. And then Derek Ferguson was off the witness stand after.
Yeah, look, I think what they're trying to do, and I think effectively, even with him not having a response to that question, is if he really was Sean Combs, you know, financial guy, right, the CFO of a criminal enterprise, his answer might have been a little bit different to that. He would have been maybe more aware of what was going on and maybe tried to insulate himself and insulate Combs. But if the jury says he looks shocked at what's going on, then maybe he never saw evidence of a crime. Maybe the money wasn't being used to further criminal activity. So his lack of a response can actually be used by the defense, that these charges were just as shocking to him as they are to our client. And like he said, if this was a criminal enterprise, none of these alleged crimes are actually benefiting the company. Although I think the way that the prosecution has categorized it is, as long as Sean Combs is being benefited, as long as his sexual desires are being benefited, as long as everybody agrees that's what the common purpose of this criminal enterprise, that might be the key there. So listen, a lot of testimony. We know Jane Doe is going to take the stand. That's going to be huge. We also know that Brianna Bangolan is probably going to take the stand. This is the person that Combs allegedly dangled off of Cassie Ventura's, deck. So that'll be really important as we talk about a pattern of abuse towards women, corroborating Cassie's testimony and others' testimony. So really, really interesting. Elizabeth, I know that was a lot of information, a lot of details, but appreciate you taking the time, and great reporting as always.
Thanks, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.